Thank you very much, and thank you for having me here. And I'm delighted to be part of our journey in exploring this wonderful book that we're going to be hearing about from our guest today. Just as a brief intro, I'm Suresh Venkat. I'm a professor of computer science and data science. I direct the Center for Tech Responsibility here at Brown in the Data Science Institute. And I've been, from the computer science side of this, been sort of thinking about issues of the collisions of tech and society for a long time. So I'm really excited to hear this presentation, to hear and to have read the book and to hear what our guests are going to be saying, how to think about race, robots, and the politics of our technological futures. And with that, I'd like to introduce our guest today. Neda Atanasoski is a professor and chair of the Harriet Tubman Department of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at the University of Maryland, College Park. She is the author of Humanitarian Violence, the U.S. Deployment and Diversity, co-author of Surrogate Humanity, Race, Robots, and the Politics of Technological Futures, and co-editor of Post-Socialist Politics and the Ends of Revolution, both with Kalindi, Vora. She is currently the co-editor of the journal Critical Ethnic Studies. Previously, Atanasoski was professor and the founding co-director of the Center for Racial Justice at UC Santa Cruz. Kalindi Vora is professor of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies, of Ethnicity, Race, and Migration, and of American Studies at Yale University. Dr. Vora's current research includes ongoing writing and publishing on artificial intelligence and automation through the lens of STS and critical race and gender theories. They are also beginning a book project supported by a National Science Foundation Science and Technology Studies Award, tentatively titled Autoimmune: Chronic Conditions and Care in a Time of Uncertain Medicine. They are the author of multiple books, including Surrogate Humanity, which is co-authored with Dr. Neda Atanasoski. I'd like to welcome our guests up to the stage to start your presentation. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here today. We wanted to start by thanking the many of you who have actually been involved in our visit. And specifically, we wanted to thank the Center for the Study of Race and Ethnicity in America, and particularly Stephanie LaRue, as well as Trey Alston-Swan and Maggie Murphy, who've all helped manage the logistics of our visit. And of course, Suresh Venkata Subramaniam, who's our host for today. So today, Neda and I will speak from our 2019 book, Surrogate Humanity, in which we theorize how racial capitalism, which is a term we can talk about more if you want, how racial capitalism and the US specific history of indigenous genocide, chattel slavery, xenophobia around immigration, and anti-Asian outsourcing imaginaries inform the design of machines that are intended to interact socially with humans. And what we're going to do is talk through some examples from across the chapters of the book, whose topics range from discussions of the sharing economy and the Internet of Things to social and companion robots and drones and robots with lethal capacities. A number of the projects we'll talk about today and in the book were prototypes or even speculative when we discovered them. And so in the book and in our talk, we dwell on the importance of the desires and imaginaries behind these engineering projects and their development. And we do this rather than thinking about the sociology of their actual uptake, which is important, and we can talk about that as well. And so as we present, we'll switch back and forth and share some of the arguments and examples from the book. We're opening with the example of a device called the Mine Kafan, created by Afghani designer Masood Hassani and designed in Kabul. The Kafan is a wind-powered metal ball with bamboo legs. The prototype is designed to be heavy so that as the wind blows it across war-ravaged lands that are laden with mines and not yet activated mines, the sweeper can trip them with its weight as it tumbles. The bamboo spikes are designed to blow off of this porcupine-like ball whenever it impacts a landmine, and the center will remain intact. As a result, the Kafan can take up to 4 explosions. And it's also relatively economical to create. The cost to replace each unit is around $40 US. Hassani says that his goal in designing the Kafan is to clear the world of landmines within a decade with low-cost tools such as this wind-powered minesweeper. And we're beginning our talk with this example of a caring, autonomous technology as an example from outside the mainstream imaginaries we critique, outside those imaginaries of how technologies can replace humans. The Kefan, which moves without human intervention or control, right, it's wind-powered, is in a sense autonomous, free of human interaction or human motivation. And although it moves on its own, Hassani's design is not a robot, despite the title of our book, nor is it a high cost or high-tech design. Unlike the US military technologies we'll introduce in a moment, the Kefan could be read as a carrying technology, performing the usually feminized work of cleaning up the ravaged landscapes produced by war, rather than taking part in acts of killing or destruction. Because the minesweeper also cares for human life, we find it interesting that it effectively untethers caring from the purview of a human actor. So as an example of another drastically different design imaginary, our book actually focuses more on projects developed by the US military. For instance, the firm Boston Dynamics, which has received and continues to receive US government funding for developing military robotics, gained notoriety in October of 2013 when it released a video of a 6-foot-tall, 320-pound humanoid robot named Atlas running freely through the woods. Have any of you seen the Atlas videos? Yes, I think many people will have seen them. So just in case you haven't, we wanted to play a little montage of Atlas. So Atlas is a prototype that was first introduced to the media as standing in for soldiers in the theater of war. And then shortly thereafter was touted as a rescue robot instead, right? So don't see this as a soldier, see it as a humanitarian robot, intended to replace soldiers in dangerous landscapes such as minefields. So in that, you see the comparison to the Kefan. But also firefighters, police officers, and agents cleaning up nuclear waste. Numerous media reports about the robot insisted that it was much easier to imagine this huge machine as a super soldier than as a humanitarian actor. One reporter proclaimed, at 6'2" and 330 pounds, the US Army's new Atlas robot just might give Arnold Schwarzenegger a run for his money. Atlas can turn knobs, manipulate tools, and yes, fire machine guns, end quote. So like other Boston Dynamics robot development projects, Atlas is funded by the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA. Here's how one journalist described a video, which is montaged here, describing Atlas's agility. Quote, the Boston Dynamics promotional video shows Atlas bending down to pick up a 10-pound boxes and pivoting its torso to place each package on the shelf. In another instance, a human handler uses a hockey stick to push Atlas off balance. The robot stumbles backwards, but catches itself before regaining its balance. Next, an employee pushes Atlas down from behind. The curl dot robot, which is lying flat on its robotic face, is able to push itself up, first to its hands and its knees, before righting its torso, and then pushing up on its feet, all without the help of a human or a tether, end quote. We find that projects like Atlas demonstrate the more common and mainstream imaginary of technologies meant to replace humans. Specifically, they employ fantasies of human autonomy and command together. And these are values that we identify with the often violent history of advancing liberalism as humanism via conquest and warfare. In the book, we discuss a number of technologies that advance this imaginary, for example, designs for autonomous drones with lethal capabilities.
So Atlas isn't the only robot that undergoes pushes, shoves, and kicks within the Boston Dynamics family of robots. In fact, this is a way that the robots are demonstrating their agility and their mobility. And while these interruptions are meant to demonstrate the capacity for the robot to right itself, to be autonomous, there's a way in which we're thinking about how these moments also provoke a kind of visceral reactions among viewers in the video, a lot of which can be seen in the comment section. And this is about the motion of the robot's feet, their technical maneuver and timing. They have contradictory connotations. On the one hand, this movement inspires fear of the object rising up against its maker. But on the other hand, it inspires awe that the object appears vital or animate. That all of the Boston Dynamics robots must undergo a kicking references back to the fact of robots that they are designed to be the property of and in service to the human. As Despina Kakudaki has explained, robots are historically a fantasy for an ongoing system of enslaved labor that can't rebel. But this is a fantasy that is also always under threat. And I don't know if any of you have seen the movie that's out now, Megan, but that is one example of that. Dominant techno-utopic imaginaries direct funds, like those of DARPA, and structure engineering research labs like Boston Dynamics around the world. Therefore, they also impact the distribution of differential conditions of comfort versus misery in the present along vectors of race, gender, class, and other social hierarchies. In Surrogate Humanity, we took on this question by thinking about what we were calling the surrogate human effect of technology. The surrogate effect explains how difference continues to structure who can be human, even as it structures design imaginaries insofar as these are organized through the logics of recognition and predicated by categories of racial, gender, sexual, and other forms of difference. Utilizing the concept of the surrogate effect, we wanted to highlight a racialized and gendered relation and not literal instances in which technologies act as direct surrogates for human work. Indeed, as we pointed out through numerous examples in the book, ranging from the infamous Amazon Mechanical Turk, in which Turkers perform microtasks as stand-in for artificial intelligence, what Amazon was calling artificial intelligence, to drone warfare. The surrogate effect is a racialized structure delimiting how value is assigned to different kinds of work, including care, service, and waging war. Looking at both actually existing and, as Kalindi mentioned, still speculative technologies, ranging from the Roomba to self-driving cars, fantasies about technological emancipation from devalued work extend the history of the fully human subject as one whose freedom is actually possible only because of the surrogate effect of servants, slaves, wives, and later industrial service workers who perform this racialized and gendered labor. Thus, framing the surrogate effect of technology as a racial form, we sought to bring a feminist and critical race perspective to bear on discourses of technological enchantment, which remove human exploitation from the frame by spotlighting AI and technological objects as magic that might re-enchant those tasks understood as tedious, dangerous, or miserable. Put otherwise, Surrogate Humanity focuses on how engineering projects that create the robots, program the AI, and enhance the digital infrastructure associated with a revolutionary new era are in fact predetermined by techniques of differential exploitation and dispossession. And at the same time, a central question of our book is, how can we think about the relationship of new technologies to dissident uses and imaginaries? So throughout the book, we take up what we think of as dissident technological imaginaries, like the Mine Cathon, with which we began. As Kalindi mentioned, this is an object that doesn't claim to replace humans, but rather reclaims land and life without furthering military or imperial domination, which we read the Atlas Project is doing. These examples help us think through how design imaginaries can push at the limits of what is possible, disrupting the confining notions of what is kind of thought of as a useful design imaginary within racial capitalism. These dissident projects thus challenge the categories of even race and gender and what they do within capitalism and the kind of futures that they imagine to be good futures. In a sense, they're a bit of a break from the historically sedimented dynamics of freedom, and unfreedom woven into the fabric of technological modernity.
And one of the keywords or key terms that we use to think about this issue is technoliberalism. And this will feature in, the rest of the talk. So we define technoliberalism in the book as an innovation on what continues to exist as liberalism, where humanity is posited as an aspiration, and here in relation to technological transformation. So technology is to always assert a better and better human into the future, and that human is very specifically defined through the history of liberalism. And we understand this as continuing to obscure uneven racial and gender relations, particularly in the fields of labor and around power hierarchies. And we see these as continuing to underlie capitalist relations, even as they get obscured by how we see technology as neutral. And so another way of thinking about this is that technological futures tied to capitalist development iterate a fantasy that as machines, algorithms, artificial intelligence take over the dull, dirty, repetitive, and even reproduced labor performed by these marginalized workers of the past, the full humanity of the already human subject will then be freed for more creative pursuits. And this has been one of the fantasies underlying technology development. And we're not saying that that fantasy is bad, but we want people to understand the politics behind it. So even as more valued tasks within capitalist regimes of production and accumulation, like knowledge work, thinking about ChatGPT-3, become automatable, the stated goal of technological innovation is to liberate human potential. And that human potential has always been defined in relationship to degraded and devalued others, those who will never fully be human. And this hasn't changed, is what we're arguing. So engineering imaginaries, even as they claim revolutionary status for the various techno objects or platforms they produce that are intended to better human life, tend to be limited by a prior racial and gendered imaginary, or I should say imaginaries, of what kinds of tasks separate the human, right, the one that should be liberated for creative capacities, from the less than or not quite human enough that can continue to do the behind the scenes work to make the technologies effective. So even as technologies like industrial, military, and companion robots, which are technologies we will discuss today, even as these are designed in ways that engineers imagine will perform more perfect versions of the human, more rational killers, more efficient workers, tireless companions, these technologies still can't feel human in the sense that they, to us, because they don't experience pain or empathy. And precisely because such technologies can never be human, they allow for an exploration of the aspirations for humanity on the other side. So again, part of the background for this project and the intervention that we want to make is that contrary to the seeming abandonment of the politics of difference, right, the so-called post-race and post-labor world that technology is said to usher us into, we actually, in that future, we draw attention to the composition of the human as this abstract category, and that in fact undergirds or reaffirms the racial order of things that has and continues to undergird Euro-American modernity. So another way to say this is that the ambition to define a universal humanity has been rehearsed and updated through its incorporation into engineering imaginaries about what the human is. And these imaginaries guide the design of the future of the human through technologies that perform what Neda described as the surrogate human effect.
So to say just a bit more about technoliberalism, we actually developed this concept kind of in the middle of having finished a first draft of the book and the second. And we started thinking about it with the election of Donald Trump, when there was a debate going on where Trump was saying, I'm going to return jobs to the United States because they've been outsourced and they've been taken, by non-Americans. And then a lot of kind of tech startup CEOs came out and said, actually, it's not the sort of people in the third world or immigrants who are taking jobs, it's the robots who are taking our jobs. And we started thinking about what work that was kind of doing to say it's not people of color, it's not immigrants, it's not outsourcing, it's the robots. And we started thinking about how that that's how we kind of started making this connection between an imaginary of a post-labor world in which there were no jobs left for humans that is also effectively a post-racial world, right? Because robots, as at least as we imagine them, the ones taking over the jobs, aren't racialized, right, in the ways that we would think of human bodies. And that is basically the connection that we were trying to make, as well as to think about what that hides, right? That language of the robots are taking our jobs. And what it hides, of course, is the way in which, and we see this through a longer history of automation, not just in the present moment, but really over a much longer span of time, is a kind of further devaluation of the work that humans actually do, and often racialized and gendered human beings, right? So that kind of work of hiding the way that race and racialized and gendered labor relations continue to matter is part of a broader project of political liberalism. And this is something that scholars like David Theo Goldberg and Jody Malamed have theorized, but it's a particular technological spin on it. So for the rest of the talk, we would like to look at examples from social robotic design. So, still about a kind of labor, but a labor that often doesn't get recognized as such, right? Outside of often feminist writing, which is thinking about care. And we're gonna speak about a mainstream project, the Jibo project, a social robot, which was operational from 2014 to 2020. And we analyzed the racial engineering of Jibo by looking at the history of social robotics behind Jibo, which actually involves the work of Charles Darwin. And then we also look at an artist engineering project that offers an alternative and dissident imaginary, showing how we might unthink sort of these more dominant ways of thinking about sociality and robots.
Okay, so what I want to show you is a promotional video for a project that was developed by the roboticist Cynthia Brazil, who we're going to talk about more after this, some of her earlier work. And this project is called Jibo, and it was imagined to be the first mass-marketed interactive technology, kind of along the Alexa platform lines, that would it's not exactly a robot, but it's imagined in the family of robotics. And because it's a promotional video, it was intended, and you'll see this in the production values, to generate capital to further expand the program. But what's important to look for are the kind of discourses and images in the video that we're going to break down for you a little bit, and also thinking about the idea that this was intended to be a mass-marketed technology.
This is your house. This is your car. This is your toothbrush. These are your things. But these are the things that matter. And somewhere in between is this guy. Introducing Jibo, the world's first family robot. Say hi, Jibo.
Hi, Jibo.
Jibo helps everyone out throughout their day. He's the world's best cameraman. By intelligently tracking the action around him, he can independently take video and photos, so that you can put down your camera and be a part of the scene.
Jibo, take the picture.
He's a hands-free helper. You can talk to him, and he'll talk to you back, so you don't have to skip a beat.
Excuse me, Anne?
Yes, Jibo.
Melissa just sent a reminder that she's picking you up in half an hour to go grocery shopping.
Thanks, Jibo.
He's an entertainer and educator. Through interactive applications, Jibo can teach.
Let me in, or else I'll...
Huh.
And I'll...
Huh.
And I'll blow your house in.
Hey, where'd you go? There you are.
He's the closest thing to a real-life teleportation device. He can turn and look at whoever you want with a simple tap of your finger.
Check out my turkey dinner, Mom.
I wish you wouldn't eat that.
Hey, baby turkey pizza. I want turkey pizza.
And he's a platform, so his skills keep expanding. He'll be able to connect to your home.
Welcome home, Eric.
Hey, buddy. Can you order some takeout for me?
Sure thing. Chinese, as usual?
You know me so well. And even be a great wingman.
You have a voice message from Ashley. Want to hear it?
Absolutely.
Hey, call me when you're home.
Better make that takeoff for 2, Jibo. We've dreamt of it for...
Okay. I think that's enough. All right. Jibo is a smart device. Jibo is a smart device designed for home use and exists on a continuum with Amazon's popular Alexa smart entertainment hub, but is claimed as a robot by Brazil. And she should know, right? She's one of the preeminent social roboticists of our generation. And it ostensibly for Brazil heralds a new consumer frontier. This commercialization of social robots, and again, we don't agree that this is a robot, but we'll go with Brazil's interpretation. This commercialization, the first of its kind, inserts them into the home in a way that normalizes, we argue, the white US middle-class nuclear family form. More specifically, it advances the norm of the household as an autonomous and self-sufficient economic unit, even as it proves that this economic unit requires substantial and invisible support labor, right? So we see the way that Jibo is integrated into the household. And we ask, how is Jibo's embodiment enacting a sociality more complex than would, say, a smartphone with a rotating head? What import does the affect and embodiment of this obedient physicality, right? You notice the dips and the bobs, the squinting eye. What import does this have given the goal of making a domestic social robot as commonplace as a car or a toothbrush? The engineering imaginary behind Jibo's emotional interactivity and obedient attention brings the history of robotics into the immediate material context of the gendered and raced history of domesticity and of the normative family form in the post-World War II United States. So the robot Jibo, also described as a platform, as you heard, represents a technological update to the domestic architecture that supports this seeming autonomy of the liberal subject. Here, technoliberalism reinscribes a racialized and gendered service labor infrastructure that derives from the domestic division of labor under colonialism. It functions as an architectural update to the hidden passageways and serving spaces in U.S. antebellum residential architecture that were meant to hide the enslaved hands that served and yield the service without any sociality between those served and the servants. So this is the history that we see this machine being placed in. Jibo is designed to preserve the architecture of erased service work that allows this nuclear heteropatriarchal family economic to continue on undisturbed.
So to understand an even deeper level of racial architecture behind the gendered and raced position that Jibo inhabits, we can look at the engineering imaginary behind Jibo's emotional interactivity and obedient attention. This imaginary extends back into a colonial scientific imaginary of how the performance of emotion reveals the place of a given race on the imagined spectrum of evolution. So we're going to look at the history, and we do in the book, of how social roboticist Cynthia Brazil, also the creator of Jibo, turned to Charles Darwin's theories to program emotion and sociality into her robots. The prototype for robots like Jibo is this robot that you see here, Kismet. And it was actually one of her most famous ones from some decades ago. Built in the late 1990s, it was designed on a model of infant caregiver interaction, and it's programmed with drives, imagined to be the basic neurological underpinning of human affect. Processors, input devices, and hardware are required to animate Kismet's face. Kismet's program drives are modeled on Darwin's imagination of human biological drives and determine the robot's performance of an emotional state. Brazil says, quote, "The signaling of emotion communicates the creature's evaluative reactions to a stimulus event or act, and thus narrows the possible range of behavioral intentions that are likely to be inferred by observers." Brazil's understanding of emotion and the basic emotions that she programmed in Kismet come from Darwin's 1872 proposal that, quote, "Emotive signaling functions were selected for during the course of evolution because of their communicative efficacy," end quote. Darwin's writing on emotion and evolution precisely captures the moment when modern scientific knowledge establishes the post-Enlightenment liberal modern European subject as self-identical with the category of the human. For Darwin, those who are, quote, deprived of reason, in which he includes animals, the insane, those races distant from Europeans, become brute in character as they are reduced to base emotion. So this is from his text. Yet, as he explains, these primordial habits are the basis of our evolution as a species. These are imagined as habits that Europeans have overcome through civilization and represent the apex of humanity. And so his writing includes a discussion of Europeans being able to control their emotions and hide their emotions versus those removed from Europe or non-white Europeans as kind of transparently showing their emotion. And so if we think about Darwin's writing as the model for Brazil's design, we can read Brazil's approach to emotionally expressive robots as a kind of social Darwinism with a twist. Here, the robot is designed as a mirror to prove to us that the apex of human evolution is our ability to perform the existence of an interior psyche to the social world. Kismet and Jibo can only mirror human states transparently. The position of the robot is always inferior because it must perform affect transparently and therefore cannot perform proof of the hidden interior psyche that would indicate equality to the human. In this model of social robotics, human uniqueness is preserved and machine sociality is positioned to enrich human social life. The post-human imaginary in social robotics could have the potential to expand and redescribe the human and its social worlds, but in this instance, it instead replicates a singular scientific racial imaginary of what the human is and what it can aspire to become because of its basic Darwinian logic. As we've been mentioning, Brazil is one of the leading social roboticists in the United States and understands the physicality of the robot, its morphology and material presence in space as crucial to constructing a social relation between human and machine. And for her, facial expression, body posture, gesture, gaze, direction, and voice all work together as part of this morphology of humanoid robots, making them suited to communication with humans. So they sense the human, perceive social cues, and respond back. So then to go back to Jibo, for the robot to emerge as a social partner to the normative human that is intuitive and enjoyable for the human to interact with, it has to demonstrate that it's learning and responding appropriately through emotive expressions that are legible as properly those of fear, anger, happiness, surprise, and so on to the human user. Its intentions have to be both delimited and transparent, and its affective performance must reassure the human that in the interaction, they're the dominant user. For this to happen, the robot has to be endowed with this socio-cognitive architecture that makes it legible, but only because it's programmed with the knowledge systems of colonial modernity, right? To go back to Darwin. The socio-cognitive architecture is based upon this colonial imaginary of the great chain of being, where Darwin's lesser races were understood to run on the same basic set of drives as those programmed into the robots Kismet and Jibo. So that the very nature of the way they're engineered to interact with humans has, in fact, colonial racial inferiority hardwired into their interactive hardware and software. In other words, mainstream social robots are designed to maintain a form of relating that preserves a dominating, autonomous, post-Enlightenment subject as the only one that's recognizable as human.
To help communicate the problem of what we're arguing is a racial unconscious programmed into social robots like Jibo and Kismet, I want to talk about what we call a dissident robotics project, which comes from the artist Kelly Dobson, who actually also, like Cynthia Brazil, was in the MIT Media Lab as a PhD student here. And OMO is one of the projects that Dobson developed as part of her PhD project, Machine Therapy. Dobson argues that robots like Jibo that are imagined to replace human positions in society and in social life are modeled to represent a whole creature or person, and therefore they seem like a human replacement. companion robots, which is one of her kind of antagonists in the project, and include robots that are imagined to replace nurses in long-term care homes, but also pets, adult children, friends, right? These companion robots, which are being prototyped and imagined for a kind of large-scale production, at the same time as they are intended to allow people to live independently later into life, they also have a problematic design, according to Dobson, even as they are intended to be soothing and calming. She argues that they are also normatizing. Specifically, they are intended to help a person meet a very narrow range of socially accepted achievements, like being able to get oneself to the restroom, perhaps, or to have medicines dispensed, which are the two primary examples that she uses. And like Jibo's performance of support labor in the household, this reproduces an imaginary of social life that gets reduced from what we actually have in the world. Excuse me. And she also is concerned with the fact that social robots and specifically companion robots are not meant to present their own anxieties and neuroses, but simply, again, to comfort, serve, and survey. And so this might at first not seem like a problem, but as Dobson points out, it actually reinscribes neurotypicality as an assumption that we have about people that we're interacting with. So Dobson designed Omo to, quote, be experienced by a person as in between being a part of that person, and this is the chalk drawing. Dobson's representing this here. So in between being a part of the person, something akin to a prosthetic or a body part, and as a separate thing. And this is, again, against those other kinds of bots that are troping whole anthropomorphic others. So I'm just going to quietly play Dobson's video demonstrating some of Omo's uses. So as you can see, Omo is constructed as a football-shaped orb, and it has a springy external surface that's meant to feel like skin. And the mechanism expands and contracts at a regular volume. See, this little hole is like a breathing hole. So air goes in and out, and the volume and rate of the expansion and contraction is programmed to vary in response to a pressure pattern. So that could be holding it against a breathing body. It will respond to the pressure pattern, or the vibration of a machine. And in Dobson's project, it's important that these objects are therapeutic for both mammals, I guess, breathing creatures, but also machines. And in her demo video, you'll see Omo is interacting with an electric dryer at one point. And so also, it's important that Omo can follow a breathing pattern or lead it. So it's not a servant bot. And Dobson describes Omo as a transitional object, saying the machine may sometimes effortlessly and smoothly seem like a part of the person holding it. And at other times, the person may perceive the very same machine as separate, its own being. It may seem in some situations to behave like an organism, a creature, or a sympathetic friend, pet, or partner, but is designed to not be stably or reliably as such. It's not designed to be a servant employee machine, but rather has errors and noise built into its programming that lead it to occasionally act erratically and possibly break down, end quote. So you can already start to see how this is different from the kind of mainstream profit-driven robot imaginary. So Dobson's critique we find important because human functional equivalents, like companion robots, both reflect and shape fantasies of human otherness. And as people interact and reflect from these caring machines and soothing machines, people are, in effect, being trained into new understandings of caring and soothing themselves. And this changes our understandings and definitions of care, much like our definitions of work changed and what it is to work changed with industrialization. So that's another example of machines changing common social understandings. So Jibo and also Omo, as a critique of projects like Jibo, point to the affective aspect of what we call the surrogate human relation. Technologies of artificial intelligence and robotics, like those required to automate labor, project again, to rehearse what Neda said, a colonial scientific ordering of things, not just now, but into the future. And so again, that's part of the concern, is the way that we basically build the architectures of the present into the future. And I often talk about, when I'm trying to help people understand the stakes, seems like a small example, but you might remember when Uber first became an app, many people downloaded it onto their phones while it was still being beta tested and started using it. And almost instantly, there was an infrastructure and a new form of labor that evolved without any kind of ethical oversight. And so this is what we're concerned about, the way that prototypes and fantasies can become architecture almost overnight. Okay, I think
we're going to conclude really briefly with an art project that returns us to the examples that we opened with around military robotics and military objects. And it's an Italian artist group that produced this photographic collections that they called drone selfies. They created these photos, as they said, to imagine an alternative present where war is over and drones, once surveillance devices par excellence, are deprived of their main reason to be and point their built-in cameras to mirrors in an act of vanity. And we were just really taken by this humorous kind of angle on what it means to think about drone vanity, and sort of what it was that this group was offering and the possibility of drones seeing themselves rather than human soldiers seeing targets in the field of war. And according to Filippo Cutica, one of the artists, he stated, quote, "Our drones are definitely presenting their own images, taking photos to create and promote their public images. We cannot really say whether they like themselves. They're not humans after all." So this, in our book, we write about as a kind of disruption to the dominant way in which drones enact a sort of surrogate effect or surrogate relation. And here, these are sort of autonomous weapons, but very different than, for example, killer robots or autonomous lethal weapons that we write about in the book. And they actually question some normative presumptions about the politics of life and death that structure contemporary debates about the ethics of warfare in the age of roboticized weapons. We can read these photographs in the Drone Selfie series as a speculative account of a piece made possible by seeing what drones would do without humans. The human self can only be at the center of this speculative future as an absent presence. This isn't a post-human future, though, but one in which the co-assemblage of humans and technology is reasserted by troubling the purpose and intended use of military objects. The proposition of drone vanity asserts a future in which military objects become useless. And this is really significant, right? Because most technological designs are about use and efficiency and value. And so the Drone Selfies project separate ethics and morality from liberal assumptions about human nature, suspend temporality of the surrogate effect, in which becoming moral is the project of feeling human, a future projection that is untenable given the history of colonial and racial violence attached to empathy and relationality that has thus far structured the figure of the human. So I think we'll end there.
Thank you, both of you. That was fantastic. And those examples are just so amazing. And it's funny as you talked about how these things start off as prototypes and become reality. And, you're mentioning all these examples, and there's so many examples from today flashing through my head. So I feel like it's always important to start every conversation with ChatGPT. So I'm going to start there. I was reading an article, actually, after I was reading a book and then I was browsing the web and I found this article. The title was "The 10 Top Jobs That Are Going to Be Taken Away by AI." This was in KTLA News, a local Southern California sort of newsroom. And there's a list of them. I can read them off. They're just cashier, customer service rep, bookkeeper, IT support technician, I take that personally, billing clerk, HR assistant, paralegal assistant, compliance officer, claims assistant, executive assistant. You talk about this in the book as well, this constant recurring fears and lists. And then the article went one step further. It said, put in your profession and ChatGPT will tell you whether it thinks your job will be out or not. So I did that. And I think you will like to know what it said. So I put in my job professor and it said, the answer to this question is that it depends on the type of job the professor has. if the professor is teaching a subject that can be taught by AI, such as mathematics or computer science, then the job is at risk of being replaced by AI. However, if the professor is teaching a subject that requires more human interaction, such as literature or history, then the job is less likely to be replaced by AI. So I'm worried, you're safe. It's all good. I want to throw in one more quote here, because it's funny how when I read your book and I read the framing that you point out, that you sort of make visible in your thing, I keep hearing echoes of it everywhere, all over the place now. It's kind of like it's everywhere. I can't not find it. And I'll read this quote, and this is kind of interesting. We want AGI, artificial general intelligence, to empower humanity to maximally flourish in the universe. We don't expect the future to be an unqualified utopia, but we want to maximize the good and minimize the bad, and for AGI to be an amplifier of humanity. I mean, you talked about this just now. This is, by the way, is a quote from the founder of OpenAI, Sam Altman, in an article he wrote a few days ago, talking about our wonderful AGI futures, for which he got deservedly slammed all over the place. But anyway, that's a different story. So I guess what I want to understand, the thing that I'd like to ask you all about is, when you talk about the humanoid robots and the surrogacy of robots and the way we place them in surrogacy as a way to imagine this post-racial, post-gendered future, but that we don't actually. I feel like it's much worse than that, because when you talked about Jibo and you talked about emotion recognition, you talked about how Cynthia Brazil models how robots express emotions based on theories of how going back to Darwin. There's a whole trend of work in emotion recognition in technology, where using, for example, video scans of how you talk in an interview to decide whether you should be hired for a job, which has gone the exact opposite way, in the sense of using archetypes of emotion to judge what's readable about us by an algorithm. In other words, rather than making the robots surrogate humans, we are being made into machine readable entities like robotic humans. And I feel like that's, in the hope that we will have robots that play the surrogate role for us, we are in fact, on the other hand, making ourselves more readable to the robots, which seems far worse. I just want to throw it out there as a reflection on what I'm hearing.
Yeah, I think that's actually very astute. I think it's actually in line with what we're arguing, and particularly one of the examples we ended with, which is Kelly Dobson's concern about how having companion robots that are meant to replace nurses, health aides, et cetera, actually not only limits the kind of care we receive, but trains us to expect less care. And so in a similar way, we're seeing these technologies that read emotion, again, restructuring what it means to even be human. And people have talked about this with other technologies as well. So we begin to perform different expectations even for one another. And I can imagine once these technologies are circulating, we will change the way we express, especially facially, affect, right? But I do think it's in line with the argument that the technologies are based on this, or being designed on an imaginary that understands human progress as perfect rationality. So if you have an AGI that's successful, then it will be able to read human emotion better than we can, right? So that's part of this kind of projection into the future.
And I'm so fascinated that I'm going to go back to I agree obviously with everything Kalindi said, but I want to go back to this quiz the chat that you had about job obsolescence. So these kind of quizzes have been around for at least the last, decade. I remember when we were writing this book, I was living in Oakland and commuting 70 miles to Santa Cruz, and almost every day on NPR be like, will your job become obsolete? And so then I think one of the questions is when a particular kind of story or quiz, BBC ran one, I don't know, like 7, 8, 9 years ago, what is the kind of the function of these questions being posed over and over again? And again, I think that's part of what we were thinking about is kind of the way in which what gets concealed is how, certain workers are kind of further invisibilized. And so I'm actually really interested in how they have ChatGPT being involved in these obsolescence conversations. The other thing, that's that your comment made me think about is this kind of the fear that robots will take over. And I don't really know, it's not something that we actually wrote about it in the book, but I think this question of kind of when something becomes alive or animate is really an interesting one too, because I was reading an article about ChatGPT this morning, and then there was like a link to it, like when chatbots become creepy. And so like I clicked on it, and of course it went to like the Bing and the Sydney and the, and she was expressing being alive and in love. And it's so interesting to me, like kind of what that line between like the fear of AI and the question of like life and animacy is, I think, a really interesting one too, and could potentially be related to the kind of thinking we were doing around the surrogate human effect as well.
Can I say one more thing with the large language models? So because I've been thinking a lot about it, and I know a lot of people are really interested in the chatbot question. And so I thought maybe to help understand the arguments of the book, we could actually think about how they apply to these large language models. And I don't know if people are familiar with the former members of the Google AI and ethics team who were fired and or asked to resign after their The Danger of Stochastic Parrots article, which actually outlines some concerns about large language models that line up very well with our book. And so as many of you probably know, the database for at least ChatGPT-3 is mostly trained on, from what I understand, Wikipedia, Reddit, these kind of large databases. And of course, those are all in English, and only 5% of the world's population speaks English as a mother tongue. Also, it's quite, and I'm looking at you to confirm this, it's quite expensive to update the training of these large language models. And so the ability to actually have them keep up with social change is quite narrow. And so in some ways we can say that they are like very literally inscribing a very minoritarian view of the world into what's accessible when we use or interact with these large language models. And I think to me that illustrates very well, even though it's not actually a robot, again, it's a neural network. So it's not quite the same, obviously, as an AI, but it is being taken up socially as if it were an AI, right? So I'm interested in thinking more about how, and I just learned yesterday from a colleague at University of Michigan that there is a Chinese language-based large language model informed chatbot. So I still don't think it solves all the problems, but one of the kind of underlying concerns in our book is the way that, when we talk about colonial modernity, we're not just talking about relationships of oppression or historical hierarchies. We're talking about the way that the world has gotten overwritten by a very limited story of what humans are and what history is. And then that's getting reinscribed even more narrowly through interfaces like the ChatGPT-3 bot.
This is a good segue. I did want to come back to your distinction between a neural net and AI, but
I want to hear everything you have to say about that.
We'll get to that later. But you mentioned dissident projects, and you mentioned the colonial aspects of this, right? There's a streak of, for many years now, there's been this thread of essentially data nationalism, which is a term for it, where roughly speaking, countries, especially in Asia, especially in China and related countries, have argued that why should we give our data to Google to index for a Western company's perspective? Why shouldn't we control our data of our people ourselves? Now, there are many political dimensions to why these arguments were made, and I'm not saying all of them are innocent, but there's this thread around who owns our data and who gets to tell stories about it. And to that end, and also to my attempt to find something not depressing to take away from your book, because it made me feel very sad about the field I'm in. You gave these wonderful examples of these dissident projects. I think are amazing. And you talked about this project, this very quirky drone selfie project. And there's been the movement, especially in the world of natural language processing, you mentioned this, so that work there, about how to essentially decolonize the sort of hegemony of English as one language that is used to describe the fact that Wikipedia is so much in English and that all these other sources are in English. There's this work, for example, by Tehiku Media in New Zealand, trying to reclaim the Maori language, trying to reclaim the use of technology to develop the Maori language, to build the infrastructure of NLP, the infrastructure of machine translation to work there. Because in a world that we use Google Translate, the only things we see are things we can see through technology. And they're trying to make sure that technology can see the language. And so there's these beginning movements. And I think of that, and I think of what you're talking about. And is that in the line of kinds of things you're, or if not advocating for, sort of holding up to light as ways to combat this technologism and
I think so. I mean, oftentimes after we present this work, people say, okay, well, what hope is there in the future?
I have a question.
And,
I knew
it was coming. No, but in seriousness, I think that most of the answers are a matter of scale. So the problem is often the imposition of, a relatively small demographics idea of what technology is for and what it should do upon a large population or geography of people. And so the example you shared is tailored to meet the interests, the politics of a delimited group. And I'm sure that there's some erasures going on there. Anytime you have homogenization, right, you have this problem. But still, when I teach this material in my classes, I'm always looking for, and there are many examples of small scale projects that are empowering languages that are being lost, worldviews, mythologies, histories that are being lost. So I do think that is one place, absolutely, that we can find, if not large scale systemic change, dissidents, right, protest. So world revolution is something we wrote about in our other book, our edited book, The Fantasy of World Revolution. We can talk about that too. But yeah, I think the smaller scale protest is where the hope is.
And I'll just add that, the examples that we gave of dissident technologies were like an art project, OMO. But in general, when we get asked this question, sometimes I think it's easy for people to like, okay, so there's like bad, and I don't think that's something we try to do in the book. Like, okay, so there's bad technology and bad technological design and good technology. And I guess the one thing I would just add is I don't think that there's such a clean distinction between like good technology and design and bad technology design, but it's about, obviously there's like the dominant intended use and the kind of relations that those produce, but there's also always different ways of relating through those very same technologies, platforms, et cetera, and different ways of putting them to use as well. I think that's why we wanted to end with the drone selfies, right? Because these sort of military intended drones, I mean, obviously it's a speculative project, but yeah, thinking about different kinds of relations that can be enacted.